The story begins with 5 longtime friends, Dom, Luke, Phil, Hutch and Rob, who have made a tradition of traveling together across Europe. As they debate their next destination, suggestions range from Ibiza to Amsterdam, Berlin and Belgium. In the end, Hutch sides with Rob's idea and they settle on hiking the King's Trail, a remote path straddling the border of Sweden and Norway. Later that night, on their way home, they pass a convenience store. Still eager for another drink, Luke convinces Rob to stop inside. As they browse, Luke casually voices his reluctance about the upcoming hike, knowing Dom's habit of complaining. His words trail off when he notices something unsettling: the cashier frozen in place, her face bruised. A second later, 2 armed robbers step into view, one already threatening a customer. Luke's body reacts before his mind does. He instinctively backs away, slipping behind a shelf. He watches in silence as one of the robbers turns to Rob, demanding his wallet and watch. Rob complies, but when they reach for his wedding ring, he refuses. A moment of tension. Then, without hesitation, the robber strikes. Rob collapses, his body motionless. Hidden in the shadows, Luke remains frozen, fear rooting him to the spot as his friend dies before his eyes. 6 months later, the remaining 4 friends embark on their long-promised journey. The King's Trail stretches before them, vast and untamed. At the highest point, they place Rob's photo, a silent tribute against the endless sky. Standing together, they pray, wishing he were there to see the view with them. The next morning, they resume their journey. As Luke had expected, Dom grumbles throughout the hike, his frustration mounting until he missteps and falls. A sharp cry of pain follows. His ankle is sprained, making it difficult for him to walk the remaining 14-hour trek to the lodge. Luke suggests splitting up, leaving Dom with Phil while he and Hutch search for help. But Dom refuses. Instead, he supports Hutch's alternative, a shortcut through the forest, convinced they can still reach the lodge by nightfall. Yet as they step beneath the dense canopy, an unsettling silence surrounds them. No birds, no rustling, not even the faintest chirp of insects. Then, they see it. Hanging from a tree, its body motionless, is a deer carcass. The fresh blood dripping onto the ground suggests it was recently taken down. Tension fills the air. Hutch assumes hunters might have done it to lure larger animals. Phil, on the other hand, suspects a bear. Either way, one thing is clear: they shouldn't stay. Dusk arrives swiftly. Storm clouds gather, covering the last hints of daylight. Thunder rumbles in the distance before the rain begins to pour. Moving forward is no longer an option. Hutch suggests setting up camp, but before they do, Luke notices something unusual: a weathered, ancient symbol carved deep into a nearby tree. He considers mentioning it, but the others barely glance at it. Their attention is drawn elsewhere, to an old abandoned cabin barely visible through the downpour. It's their best chance for shelter. A strange unease settles over Luke. Something about the cabin feels off, but with the rain growing heavier, there's no time to debate. Hutch and Phil force the door open and step inside. Dom follows. Luke hesitates outside, a sudden, instinctive fear gripping him. Then, he hears it, a deep, echoing sound, low and unnatural, vibrating through the trees. He quickly turns, scanning the darkness. But there's nothing, no movement, no glowing eyes, just the endless void of the forest. And none of his friends seem to hear it. Inside the cabin, they find strange decorations adorned with ancient symbols. While exploring upstairs, Phil stumbles upon a bizarre idol, an eerie wooden figure, headless, clutching a pair of antlers. Its unnaturally thin legs resemble those of a bird. The longer he stares, the more unsettling it becomes. A sense of unease lingers, but they brush it off, choosing to get some rest. For safety, Luke insists they return to the mapped route. Hutch, however, remains calm, assuring them they have enough supplies to last. That night, Luke jolts awake to an eerie glow filtering through the window. As he steps outside, the dense forest suddenly morphs into a convenience store. The shelves are stocked, the air thick with an artificial chill. Instinctively, he reaches for his favorite drink, then a single drop of blood lands on the bottle. Before he can react, the drink rack collapses with a deafening crash, snapping him back to reality. Breathing heavily, Luke finds himself outside the cabin, a fresh wound burning on his chest. Dazed, he rushes back inside as his friend's screams pierce the silence. Dom and Hutch are gripped by terror. Hutch is so shaken, he loses control of himself. Upstairs, Phil kneels before the idol, frozen in an unsettling posture of worship. Their confusion deepens. Whatever happened that night, they all seem to have experienced the same nightmare. As morning breaks, something feels different. The ancient symbols Luke saw inside the cabin now cover every tree surrounding them. Dom is convinced. They're warnings, a clear message that they are unwelcome. Tension flares. An argument erupts over whether to turn back or push forward. Frustrated, Dom refuses to waste more time. He veers off onto a newly discovered narrow trail. The others hesitate, but ultimately have no choice. They follow. As they pressed on, Phil couldn't shake the questions gnawing at him. How had he ended up on his knees before that idol? What had Dom and Hutch seen that left them paralyzed with fear? The night's horrors remained a mystery, and the uncertainty only deepened their unease. Their path soon led them to another cabin, nestled deep in the forest. A disturbing déjà vu crept over them, but this time they didn't dare step inside. They pushed forward, unwilling to risk another nightmarish ordeal. Before long, Dom reached his limit. His injured knee throbbed unbearably, forcing him to stop. Hutch remained hopeful. The way out had to be near, likely just beyond the hill. Determined, Luke climbed to the top, his heart pounding. But as he reached the peak, his breath caught in his throat. Stretching endlessly before him was not salvation, but an unbroken expanse of dense forest. His stomach twisted with dread. Then his eyes locked onto something far worse, a hand, grotesquely embedded in a tree as if fused with the bark, and lurking behind the foliage, an enormous shadow stirred. A cold wave of terror washed over Luke. What was that thing hiding in the trees? He didn't wait to find out. He spun around and raced back to his friends, his mind reeling. Struggling to catch his breath, he told them everything, what he had seen beyond the hill, and the unexplainable wound that had appeared on his chest after the nightmare. Instead of listening, Dom lashed out. He accused Luke of harming himself and blamed him for their entire predicament. If Luke had done something, anything, when Robert was being mugged, they wouldn't be trapped in this nightmare. The accusation struck a nerve. Rage boiled over, and before Luke could stop himself, he threw a punch, sending Dom stumbling backward. The tension hung heavy between them, but they had no choice but to move forward. As they trudged through the oppressive wilderness, something unexpected broke the monotony. A flower garden, strangely out of place. Hutch saw it as a sign. Someone must have been here before. Hope flickered, but it was short-lived. Buried beneath a cloth, they unearthed a pair of shoes and a wallet. Inside, an expired credit card bore the name Anna Eriksson, dated 1984. A chilling thought crossed their minds. What had happened to Anna? Why had she abandoned her belongings? The realization settled over them like a thick fog. If she had never made it out, what chance did they have? So as darkness settled over the forest, they had no choice but to set up camp. Exhaustion weighed heavily on them, and they needed rest before continuing their journey. That night, Hutch checked on his friends. Dom's knee had worsened, swelling to the point where walking seemed impossible. Phil wasn't doing much better. His face was pale, and his hands trembled from an unseen fear. Only Hutch and Luke were still in decent condition. Realizing this, Hutch turned to Luke, his voice low but firm. "Keep moving and find help." Hutch would stay behind to take care of the others. Then, the nightmare returned. Luke found himself back in the convenience store, except now their tent was inside. Across the aisle he saw Robert just moments before he was attacked, but something was different. A towering figure loomed over Hutch's tent. Then, without warning, it moved. Luke jolted awake. His chest heaved as he scanned the camp. Phil was kneeling on the ground, shaking uncontrollably. Something was wrong. Luke scrambled over and shook Dom awake, but before they could process what was happening, a chilling scream pierced the night. They froze. The scream was distant but unmistakable. They wanted to run after him, but Dom grabbed Luke's arm. If they wandered aimlessly in the dark, they might never make it back. Morning brought no relief. They searched for hours, clinging to the hope that Hutch was safe. But when they finally found him, hope shattered into horror. Hutch's body was hanging from a tree, his condition eerily similar to the deer carcass they had seen earlier. The brutal sight left them speechless, but there was nothing they could do. They covered him with branches, a pitiful attempt at a burial, before forcing themselves to move on. Luke clenched his fists. He knew whatever had done this wasn't finished. The question wasn't what had taken Hutch, it was who, or rather what, had left him like that. Luke's mind went back to the hill, to the shadowy figure lurking behind the trees. It had to be that thing. Determined to avoid the same fate, they veered off course. Luke had spotted a fresh set of footprints, massive and unlike anything human. If the creature had come this way, they needed to go the other way. What they didn't realize was that it was watching them. Hidden between the trees, it observed their every move. It wasn't hunting them just yet. It was playing with them. Dom's knee had reached its breaking point. He could barely stand. Meanwhile, Phil still looked haunted, his eyes distant as if he could feel the creature's presence pressing down on him. And the worst part, they weren't even close to escaping. By the time they reached the hill, Luke scouted ahead, scanning the path for any possible escape. Eventually, he spotted a flicker of light in the distance, a house or maybe a settlement. Wasting no time, he turned back, sprinting toward the others. But as he arrived, he found Phil frantically searching for something on the ground. Before Luke could speak, a shadow loomed over Phil, and in an instant, the creature seized him. Phil's scream barely lasted a second before it was cut off, replaced by the deep, guttural growl of something closing in. Fear took hold of Luke. He bolted, running blindly through the dark forest until he slammed into a tree. Darkness swallowed him. In his dream, he was back inside the convenience store. Shelves stood empty, the overhead lights flickered, and then Robert. He rose from the floor, his eyes hollow, his voice cold. Escape was impossible, he said. There was no way out. Luke jolted awake. The nightmare lingered for a moment before he spotted Dom crouching behind a tree. His face was pale, his breath uneven. He thought Luke had abandoned him. "No. I found a way out," Luke whispered urgently. "We need to move." On the count of 3, they ran. The light ahead grew closer, but as they burst through the trees, they skidded to a stop. Phil hung lifeless from a thick branch above them, swaying slightly in the wind. There was no time to grieve. The sound of snapping branches signaled the creature's approach. They had no choice but to keep running. Desperation fueled their steps until suddenly they weren't alone anymore. A group of strangers emerged from the shadows, their faces unreadable. Before Luke could react, one of them lunged, kicking him square in the chest. The impact sent him crashing to the ground. When he woke, Dom was shaking him. Dim candlelight flickered against the wooden walls. Their hands were bound, their surroundings unfamiliar. A door creaked open. Several villagers entered, their gazes unreadable. An elderly woman stepped forward, offering Luke a cup of water. Her eyes lingered on his chest wound, her fingers tracing a carved symbol on her own skin, an exact match. Before Luke could comprehend what it meant, Dom was yanked to his feet. They dragged him upstairs, the sound of fists meeting flesh echoing through the wooden walls. One of the women finally spoke. Dom was to be offered by sundown. Later they led him outside, binding him to a wooden post as the last light of day faded. Then, a deep, inhuman roar rippled through the trees. As if commanded, every villager dropped to their knees, their heads bowed in silent worship. Surprisingly, Dom's wife, Gail, appeared to calm him down. But it was nothing more than an illusion. The creature used it to lower Dom's guard before pulling him from the post and dragging him into the forest. In the end, he didn't survive. Meanwhile, Luke, who had managed to free himself from his restraints, sat in silent despair. He had failed to save Dom, just like before. A woman approached him, her voice devoid of sympathy. She explained that the sacrifice would take place that night, a ritual meant to welcome him into the cult and solidify their devotion to their deity. The creature that had killed Dom, she revealed, was no ordinary beast. It was an ancient god, one of the Jotun, an illegitimate offspring of Loki. She refused to utter its name, bound by a rule that forbade it. By worshipping this god, the cultists had gained immortality, freed from pain and suffering. Then, with a chilling certainty, she warned Luke, kneel before it, or share Dom's fate. After she left, Luke steadied his breath. He had to escape. Moving cautiously, he reached for the door. But before he could slip away, an elderly woman blocked his path, the cult's leader. With no other choice, he retreated upstairs, his pulse hammering in his ears. From a nearby room, low chanting filled the air. Drawn by the sound, Luke stepped inside and froze. Mummified corpses lined the chamber, but to his horror, some were still alive. Their hollow eyes locked onto him, and then one by one they began to scream, their voices sharp and desperate. A warning. Luke didn't hesitate. He reached for the nearest torch and set the room ablaze. Flames crawled up the walls, devouring the wooden beams. The screams turned into wails of agony, loud enough to summon the god itself. A guttural roar tore through the night, shaking the cabin. Luke didn't wait to see it. He sprinted toward the weapons storage, his mind focused on one thing: survival. His hands found a shotgun. The moment a cultist burst through the door, he pulled the trigger. One down. But the real threat was still out there. Luke turned his weapon on another man, but something was off. The man wasn't attacking. He was frozen in terror, his eyes locked on something behind Luke. Following his gaze, Luke saw the truth. The woman who had spoken to him earlier was being punished by the creature, a divine judgment. Then the monstrous god turned its gaze on Luke, a silent command, a warning. The air thickened with its presence, and Luke's instincts screamed at him to run. He did. But the creature was faster. As he sprinted through the trees, its form shifted, distorting reality. Shadows twisted, illusions clouded his vision. Before he could react, it struck. The impact sent Luke crashing to the ground. Pain shot through his body as the creature seized him, forcing him onto his knees. A silent demand: kneel, submit, worship. His limbs trembled, drained of all strength. He couldn't fight, not anymore. But then, a shadow flickered at the edge of his vision. Robert, a reminder of everything he had lost. The weight of his past failures pressed down on him, but so did the promise he had made to Dom. Survive, escape. A fire reignited in his chest. With the last of his strength, Luke pushed himself to his feet. His fingers found the axe. In one swift motion, he swung, striking the god, tearing himself free from its grasp. And then he ran. The forest blurred past him, his only focus on the border, the line between captivity and freedom. As he broke through the tree line, the weight of the curse seemed to lift. He turned back, breathless, heart pounding. The creature loomed at the edge of the forest, unable to cross. Luke's chest rose and fell, his body shaking with exhaustion. And then he screamed, a raw, defiant cry, not of fear but of victory. The sun climbed over the horizon, its golden light washing over him. He had escaped. But as the light stretched across the landscape, the question lingered. Had he truly survived? Or was this just another illusion, another trick to pull him back into the cursed woods?